Something about you has started to make people uncomfortable. You didn't say anything wrong. You didn't do anything offensive. But something changed. They can feel it. At first, it's subtle. A pause that lingers a little too long. A look that doesn't quite match the moment. A question that sounds simple, but isn't. Are you okay? And you are. But that's not really what they are asking. What they are sensing is this. You're no longer responding the way you used to. And you didn't decide to do that. You didn't plan it. You didn't rehearse it. It just stopped happening. The urgency, gone. The need to explain, gone. The impulse to smooth things over, to adjust yourself, to make everything feel okay again. Slower, quieter. Sometimes, not even there. The strange part is, it doesn't feel wrong. It doesn't feel like something is missing. It feels like space, like something that used to move too fast inside you, finally slowed down. For a moment, it even feels like relief. But then, people start reacting differently, not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's just a shift in tone, a slight increase in intensity, an attempt to pull more from you than you're giving, as if something they expected to happen didn't. Now they are trying to find it again, because without realizing it, you stopped showing up in a way they had quietly learned to rely on. You're still there, still listening, still aware, but something about you is no longer as accessible as it used to be, and that creates something most people are not comfortable facing. Space, unfilled space, and in that space, something begins to surface. Not immediately, not clearly, but unmistakably. A subtle tension, a quiet awareness that something about you has shifted, and once that shift becomes visible, your silence stops being neutral and starts changing everything around you. That space you created didn't stay empty for long. Silence, in relationships, is never just the absence of words. It does something. It shifts the entire emotional field. Before, there was a rhythm. You may not have noticed it at the time, but it was there. Someone would say something, and you would respond, almost immediately. Sometimes with words, sometimes with tone, sometimes just with energy. But something in you always moved toward the moment. If there was tension, you felt it, and without thinking, you adjusted, you clarified, you softened, you reassured, you closed the gap, not because you had to, because you were attuned, sensitive to what was happening beneath the surface, aware of shifts most people don't even register. And over time, that way of responding became something others could rely on, not consciously, but consistently. They didn't have to think about how you would react. They already knew, and that knowing created a kind of stability, a subtle sense that things would resolve, that the space between you wouldn't stay uncomfortable for long. Not because everything was clear, but because it was predictable. Then, that predictability started to disappear. There are moments now when something is said and you don't respond right away. Not because you're holding back, not because you don't care, but because the reaction simply doesn't arrive with the same urgency. And that pause, even if it only lasts a few seconds, changes everything. They feel it, even if they don't understand it. Something that used to happen automatically didn't happen this time. Maybe it's during a conversation where someone shares something emotional and you don't rush to comfort them. You stay, you listen, but you don't move in to fix the feeling. Or maybe it's a moment of tension where before you would have softened it immediately, and now you let it exist just a little longer. Not because you want conflict, but because you're no longer absorbing it automatically. That changes more than the moment. It changes the structure. Because when you don't fill the space doesn't disappear. It grows. And what fills it now isn't your reaction. It's their awareness, their expectation, their discomfort, their uncertainty. This is where things begin to shift. Because most people are not used to being inside that space. They are used to it being managed, balanced, regulated, often by you. Now, that regulation is no longer automatic. So the silence becomes noticeable. Not just as quiet, but as something that carries weight. Something that asks a question without saying a word. Something that exposes what used to stay hidden. And for the first time, the interaction is no longer being shaped in the same unconscious way. There's a gap, a delay, a break in the pattern. And even if no one says anything, everyone feels it. Because when the rhythm changes, people don't just notice the silence. They notice themselves inside it. And what they begin to feel there is not always comfortable, because your silence is no longer supporting the dynamic, it's revealing it. And what your silence starts to reveal is exactly what some people were never meant to face. What your silence begins to reveal is not just a change in you. It reveals something in them. Because what unsettles people is not the quiet itself. It's what the quiet no longer does. There was a version of you that responded quickly, that moved toward tension, that instinctively adjusted to keep things emotionally balanced. And without realizing it, that response wasn't just kindness. It became part of how the relationship functioned. Carl Jung believed that many of our emotional reactions are not entirely conscious. That what feels like a natural response is often something deeper, something patterned, something that has repeated itself so many times that it no longer feels like a choice. And in relationships, those patterns don't exist in isolation. They connect. They form a kind of shared rhythm. One person expresses. The other responds. One creates tension. The other regulates it. One becomes uncertain. The other restores clarity. And over time, this becomes invisible, not because it disappears, but because it becomes expected. When you step out of that pattern, even slightly, the entire system feels it. Because something that used to happen automatically no longer happens the same way. This is what creates discomfort. Not your silence, but the absence of what your reaction used to provide. Before, your presence carried something. A kind of emotional responsiveness that others could lean on. They didn't have to fully sit with their own tension because something in you would meet it. They didn't have to stay in uncertainty because something in you would move to clarify. They didn't have to face the full weight of what they were feeling because something in you would help absorb it. And now, that no longer happens in the same way. You're still there, still aware, still capable of understanding everything that's happening. But you're no longer entering the experience automatically. There's a space now, a gap between what is felt and how you respond. And that gap changes everything. Because when you don't immediately participate, the other person remains inside their own experience longer, more directly, without interruption. And this is where discomfort begins to grow. Because what was once shared now becomes visible as separate. What was once regulated together now has to be felt individually. And what was once softened now stays present. This is not something most people are used to. Because many relationships are built on unconscious exchanges. Not manipulation, not intention, but patterns. Mutual adaptations that form over time. And when one person changes that pattern, the other person feels the shift immediately, even if they don't understand why. This is what Jung referred to as a form of unconscious participation, where people are not just interacting, they are emotionally entangled, reacting not only to what is happening now, but to patterns that have existed for years. And when you begin to step out of that, you don't just change your behavior, you change the entire dynamic. Because now your presence no longer absorbs, regulates, or completes the emotional loop in the same way. and what used to feel smooth starts to feel exposed. And that exposure is what makes people uncomfortable. Because once that pattern is interrupted, people don't just feel the change, they start reacting to it. Once that pattern is interrupted, something subtle begins to happen. People don't just notice the change. They start testing it. Not consciously, not in a calculated way, but instinctively. Because something in them senses that the version of you they were used to is no longer responding the same way. When something familiar disappears, the first impulse is not to accept it. It's to try to bring it back. This is where the dynamic becomes visible, not always with new meaning, but with more intensity. The same point, the same story, the same emotional signal, just delivered with more weight. As if saying it again, stronger, might recreate the response they are used to getting from you. Sometimes they push a little further. A comment that carries more edge. A tone that feels slightly sharper than before. Not aggressive enough to be obvious, but different enough that you can feel it. As if they are trying to see if something in you will react the way it used to. Other times, the test is quieter. They pause. They wait. They leave space in the conversation and watch what you do with it. Before, you would have filled it, moved in, said something to keep things flowing. Now you don't. And that absence becomes the test itself. There are also moments where the test comes disguised as concern. Did something happen? You seem different. Are you upset with me? And on the surface, it sounds like care. But underneath, there is something else. An attempt to locate the version of you that used to respond more quickly, more openly, more predictably. Because what they are really asking is not, are you okay? It's, are you still the same? And when they don't get a clear answer, the testing continues. In small ways, repeated patterns, subtle provocations, emotional cues that used to pull you in automatically. This is where things become important. Because the moment you return to the old pattern, the system stabilizes again. Everything feels familiar, smooth, recognizable. But if you don't, if you stay in that space, if you allow the reaction not to happen automatically, something else begins to form. The test doesn't disappear. It evolves. Because now it's no longer about your reaction. It's about their uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of bringing things to the surface. Things that were always there, but never needed to be seen. What starts to surface when those tests no longer work is what most people have been avoiding all along. And this is where things are often misunderstood. Because from the outside, this change can look like distance, like disinterest, like something in you has shut down. But that's not what's happening. What changed is not your capacity to feel. It's your relationship to what you feel. Before, emotion moved through you quickly. You felt it, and almost at the same time, you responded to it. There was very little space in between. And because of that, your reactions felt natural, immediate, even necessary. Now, there is a pause. A space between what is happening and how you respond. And inside that space, something new exists. Not emptiness. Not avoidance. Awareness. Awareness doesn't feel like control. It doesn't feel like you're holding yourself back. It feels like this quiet moment where something happens inside you, and instead of immediately moving with it, you notice it. You notice the urge to respond. The impulse to explain. The pull to fix what feels uncomfortable. And for the first time, you see it before you act on it. It's subtle. Sometimes it's just a fraction of a second. But in that fraction, you're no longer inside the reaction. You're watching it. And that changes the experience completely. Because now, the emotion doesn't take over in the same way. It's still there. You still feel everything. The tension, the discomfort, the need to move, but something in you stays still, not frozen, present. You're aware of what's happening without immediately becoming it. That's new, because before, there was no separation. Feeling and reacting were almost the same thing. Now, they are not. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment where unconscious participation begins to loosen, where you are no longer fully identified with what you feel. Not disconnected, not detached, but no longer merged. That changes everything. Because once you can see the reaction, you are no longer entirely controlled by it. You can choose. Not perfectly, not all the time, but enough to change the pattern. And that's why this doesn't make you colder. It makes you clearer. You don't stop caring. You stop reacting automatically in the name of caring. You don't become distant. You become present in a different way. And that difference is subtle, but it's powerful. Because now, your presence is no longer built on reaction. It is built on awareness. And awareness creates space. Space to feel without collapsing into what you feel. Space to observe without being consumed. Space to respond with intention instead of reacting out of habit. But this is where the tension begins to grow. Because while this feels like clarity to you, to others, it can feel like distance. Not because you moved away, but because you are no longer meeting them in the same unconscious place. And when that familiar meeting point disappears, people don't always recognize what replaced it. They don't immediately see awareness. They don't immediately see presence. They just feel the difference. Sometimes, they interpret that difference in ways that have nothing to do with what is actually happening. And what they begin to assume about that difference is where the next shift begins. People start forming conclusions about you. Not necessarily out loud, not always consciously, but internally they begin to interpret the change. Because when someone no longer responds the way they used to, the mind tries to make sense of it. It looks for a reason, a story, something that explains why the dynamic feels different. The first explanations are rarely accurate, because they are based on what people can see, not on what is actually happening inside you. Some will think you've become distant, that you're pulling away, that something is wrong, not because you said anything, but because you didn't respond in the way they expected. Others may feel like you've changed your attitude, that you're less open, less engaged, less willing to meet them where they are. And for some, the interpretation becomes more personal. They may feel rejected, as if your silence means something about them, as if your lack of immediate response reflects a lack of interest or care. But that's not what's happening. What changed is not your intention. It's your pattern. And most people don't see patterns. They feel the effect of them. So when the effect changes, they assume the intention has changed too. This is where misunderstanding begins. Because from their perspective, something was there before, and now it isn't. And the mind fills that gap. Sometimes with doubt. Sometimes with insecurity. Sometimes with quiet conclusions that are never spoken out loud. She's not the same anymore. Something is off. I don't know how to read her. And that last one matters. Because what many people are actually reacting to is not distance. It's unpredictability. Before, they knew how to reach you, how to move the interaction, how to get a response. Now they are not so sure. And that uncertainty creates discomfort. Because when people can't read you the same way, they can't rely on the same patterns. And when they can't rely on those patterns, they feel less grounded in the interaction. Not in a manipulative sense, but in a relational sense. The dynamic is no longer familiar, and unfamiliar dynamics require adjustment. But not everyone adjusts easily. Some will try to bring you back to who you were. Others will pull away. A few will stay, but feel uncertain. And some will never fully understand what changed. Because from the outside, it doesn't look like growth. It looks like difference. And difference is often misread before it is understood. But here's the part that matters most. None of these interpretations define what is actually happening. They only reveal how much of the relationship was built on patterns that are no longer there. And once those patterns disappear, what remains becomes clearer. Not always more comfortable, but more real. Because once those interpretations settle, what changes next is not just how they see you, it's how they relate to you. Something begins to stabilize. Not outside, inside. After the reactions, the misunderstandings, the subtle shifts in how people respond to you, a different kind of clarity starts to take shape. The need to restore things to what they were loses strength. There is no effort to go back, no attempt to recreate the old balance. What changed feels irreversible, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, undeniable sense. A new orientation forms. You no longer move toward every emotional signal. You no longer feel responsible for making every interaction resolve smoothly. The impulse to explain yourself, to ensure you are understood, to adjust your inner state just to maintain external harmony, begins to fade. This does not feel like withdrawal. It feels steady, grounded, almost as if something that was constantly moving has finally found its center. You are still present, still aware, still capable of deep connection. The difference is that your presence is no longer built on reaction. It holds its shape even in the middle of uncertainty. There is space now, yet that space is not empty. It has structure. It allows you to feel without being pulled, to listen without absorbing, to remain without merging. What happens around you no longer dictates what happens within you. That shift changes the entire experience. The urgency softens. The pressure to adjust dissolves. What once required constant calibration begins to sustain itself. An internal alignment becomes noticeable. What you feel, what you perceive, and how you respond no longer collapse into a single automatic movement. There is separation now. Not distance, but clarity. From that clarity, something deeper emerges. Not control, not detachment. Sovereignty. A quiet form of sovereignty. One that does not need to be stated, explained, or defended. It is simply lived. From the outside, this may still be misunderstood. Some will continue to read it as distance. Others may feel as though something has been lost. In a way, something has. What disappears is access to a version of you that no longer exists. What replaces it is not absence. It is presence without surrender. Not everyone will know how to meet you there. Some will try. Some will hesitate. Some will step back. That is no longer something you need to resolve. What once depended on constant adjustment now remains stable on its own. This is where the shift completes itself. Not when others understand it, but when your need for that understanding dissolves. From this point, another movement begins. The silence deepens. The impulse to explain yourself continues to fade. Your presence stops seeking validation through being understood. At that stage, the dynamic changes again. The difference is no longer only in how people react. It begins to shape who is able to remain. Not everyone stays when access is no longer immediate. Not everyone adapts when the familiar pattern disappears. And most people never reach this point. That is where the next transformation begins.